I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
He brought coherence and accountability to New York City's public schools, two key words, and it resulted in an increase in student achievement. That's the bottom line. During his tenure, he oversaw 1,700 schools, 1.1 million students, 136,000 employees, and $22 billion in budget. He's known for his responsiveness, his accessibility. He responds to emails within a few seconds. It's truly remarkable. And it's in a manner befitting of a city. His legacy is the positive one to which future chancellors aspire. Before being chancellor, he was the U.S. chairman and CEO of Bertelsmann, and of course, he served in the Clinton administration in a number of roles, including deputy White House counsel. Today, he finds himself at News Corporation as the executive vice president and a member of the board, where he's bringing his experience in both the public and the private sector to the new education marketplace. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Joel Klein.
Thank you, Michael, for that enormously generous introduction, or perhaps obituary. Let me thank you, Marcus, for this terrific piece of work. It's really an important book, and I urge people to read it, think hard about it. Also, I'm very fortunate to have been asked to write the foreword to the book, and Marcus, I thank you for that as well. Now, unfortunately, we're at the part of the proceedings where, as Adlai Stevenson reminds us, everything that could be said has been said. Unfortunately for you, not everybody's had a chance to say it, so you're going to have to bear with me for a little while I get my innings. I want to start, actually, and address almost the key comment that the mother of four said before about a great teacher. Because I think I want to frame this in real-world terms, and then get to some of the issues that Chris and Seth and Evan raised. But when I became chancellor, one of the first and most defining meetings I had was with three principals in high-performing schools in Manhattan. And I had asked them, what had we done wrong? At this point, we had a rule in New York that said if you were excessed at one school, meaning that you could no longer teach there, you had a seniority right to a vacancy at another school. So forget about all the Seth's problems of who's in the pool. He couldn't even ask this teacher a question. There was a vacancy at Democracy Prep, he's a public school, and we just put the teacher there, good, bad, or indifference. And whether she was excess because she was no good or he was no good didn't matter. And so I asked these principals, what is the worst thing we at Tweed had done to you? And I thought we were going to get a million things about, this policy or that policy. To a person, they said, well, you sent us teachers who were excessed at other schools. And I said, look, I'm opposed to that policy, but under the contract, I'm required to do it. And they said to me, don't be ridiculous, Chancellor. Every other chancellor knew you can't send our community those teachers. They could never make it in our school. And I said to them, well, what should I do with those teachers? And they said, well, look, that's not our problem, that's your problem. See, but it's not my problem. It's a problem. The clear message was send them to some other community, i.e. some high-poverty community where they have a vacancy, and that'll be just fine because they need teachers, but here we can be selective. And by the same token, you know how many people I've talked to in the last decade? And I've asked them, why did you get involved? I'm curious, why did you get involved in the Parent-Teacher Association? Even at the highest performing schools, you know how many of them have told me I got involved because I wanted to make sure my kids got the good teachers at the, So let's start by being candid with each other. We understand the dimensions of the problem and the challenges we face. And as Chris Cerf said, too often we come together as an amen corner and agree with each other and go home And then, as Marcus and others point out, that the crisis we face, which jeopardizes the kind of nation we are in K-12, continues to get talked about and discussed, but really not remotely enough is being done to change the equation. And quite frankly, time is not on our side. There are kids today throughout the United States who are in the 4th and 5th grade who are not going to graduate public school ready for the challenges of the 21st century. And that process will continue unless we get very, very serious about thinking about this process in a very different way. We continue to move around the edges and look for incremental change. We'll continue to go down a pathway toward failure. And so I want to start with actually a juxtaposition, because it's, to me, curious that just yesterday we had a piece in the newspaper in the Times called Class Matters. And today we're talking about a book called Teaching Matters. And these are one of these dichotomies that Chris was talking about that we love to fight about in an increasingly shrill discussion. And so what is this about? Class Matters means, gee, you know, the schools are okay. We just get these kids who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and there's not much we can do, so stop expecting a whole hell of a lot from the schools. And then on the other side, you have Teaching Matters, which says, no, teachers can make a huge difference. And in that polarization, it seems to me we're missing the basic formula. First of all, again, lots of things matter. Time on task matters. Curriculum matters. Lots of things matter. But in the end, there's no dispute, and all of you know it from your own existence, there's no dispute that in the absence of high-quality teaching, we are not going to succeed. It's not the only thing that matters, but you're not going to succeed. And that's what the importance of this book is, and Eric Hanushek's book is. The second thing to understand is, as Chris said, nobody I know doesn't think that poverty or challenging families or all those other things don't impact education. Let's be very practical with each other. The number of words that a kid from a middle-class family comes to school with are so entirely different from the number of words that a kid from a high-poverty family comes to school with, and that has long-term impact on reading and reading comprehension and reading scores, which Michael was talking about. So nobody should simply sort of think, oh, well, it doesn't matter. However, the question that that article in Class Matters seemed to elide is 2 points. One, the first and most important point is we know from Seth Andrews and others that the very same kids in different classrooms get entirely different results. So now it's hard to scale. And the article blows it off and says, well, it may apply to a few grades or a few schools, but no one I know doesn't think that the best schools are getting very different results from those schools that are not very good. And that's true across the board in the high poverty communities and the high-performing communities. And so we know that schools can make an enormous, enormous difference. Look at a couple of data points. Right now, today, poor kids, African-American kids in New York, in the recent national exams, are outperforming kids in other cities. In Boston and New York, you're about 2 grades ahead than you are in Detroit, for example. Those are the same kids in different cities. Let's look at the recent KIPP study. You know what the expected graduation rate for the kids who go to KIPP would be, high school or college graduation? The expected graduation rate, college graduation rate, they studied these kids from when they entered KIPP in the 5th grade through graduation. It's their first cohort. The expected graduation rate could be no better than 10 or 11% for those kids. They got a 31 or a 32% graduation rate. That's huge. Now, KIPP is right to say it's not high enough, but that's huge. What was that? We didn't give those kids new parents. What was that? That was the impact of education. I have schools in this city right now who, again, admit kids by lottery and who are overwhelmingly minority, overwhelmingly Title I, and getting results comparable to a gifted and talented school. So we know that we can get very, very different outcomes. We know at the heart of that process is the quality, consistent quality, not just one grade or one classroom, of teachers teaching high-quality curriculums in an organized and sustained fashion. And so the real question, which is the challenge, is how do we scale that, right? Because we have a lot of empiricism that addresses the kind of issues we're talking about. Now, one thing which is what the heart of today's presentation is, given what we know, we have irrational human resource policies. Nobody I know, whether you're the Manhattan Institute, the New York Yankees, or Skadden Arps, doesn't think human capital is essential to its mission. One of Bill Gates' greatest aha moments sitting on a plane is reported to be when he was then running Microsoft and had the most successful technology company in the world, was that his major competitor was Goldman Sachs. Not because they were in a tech space, but because they were competing for human capital. And yet, as this book demonstrates, we have consistently irrational human capital, human resource policies. And not surprisingly, it's not a knock on teachers, not surprisingly, policies impact how we do this. So today in the Times, and a lot of people have been saying this, today in the Times, there's an article about Finland and how the top kids in Finland, top college graduates, go into teaching. I was privileged at one point to meet with the president of Singapore, and he made this his conscious policy. He said, we don't have natural resources. We don't have industry when I got there. He said, I was making a bet on human capital. And they try to have policies that reinforce the notion that this is a profession, and indeed the future of our country depends on a teaching force that's highly professionalized, highly skilled, not just in the give and take. You got to know math. It's not just in your ability to connect up with a kid. You can connect up with a kid and have a great impact on his life. But if you don't know math and you don't know literature, you are not going to be a great teacher. So it matters that people know math and know literature. And it should matter whether our ed schools teach these things at the levels that those people are going to know. You stay a day ahead of the kid, I don't care how dazzling you are not going to have the impact that you should have. So if you look through these policies, I mean, the lock-in we get from a pension system, it says basically after 10 years, and everybody talks about the first few years, people come and go, which is true, because the system is irrational to a lot of people. But after 10 years, virtually no one leaves, because you have a pension lock-in. And you know how ridiculous that is? As Marcus points out in his book, this means for some people, not all, they're just going through the paces, because they got to get to, you're nodding your head. But, for a kid who's sitting there in the classroom, and I used to have a thing called a Chancellor's Advisory Committee. I used to talk to these kids about it all the time. I said, how many of your teachers going through the motions, And never got a number lower than a third, in most instances 40, 50, 60%, right? And it's because of a system. If I'm a great teacher in Newark, and I want to recruit that teacher here after 10, 15 years, she's not going to give up her pension rights to come here. It makes no sense. And these are human resource policies that are fundamentally broken. Right now, in virtually every union contract I know in the United States, if you get an additional 30 credits, it could be totally useless. You get 30 credits of anything you want to take, and you get a pay bump for doing that. Why would anybody do these kinds of things? And fundamentally, we do them because big power players, as Chris said, have designed a status quo that works well for them. And this is the question the country has to face, is how do we get policies in which the special interests driven by big power and big money and big political organization, the special interests, whether this is on healthcare, whether this is on gun control or education reform, the special interests are fundamentally going to decide these issues, and the generalist interest is subservient. Nobody I know thinks that these policies that Marcus is talking about shouldn't be changed or improved or whatever. I've virtually never met a person who said last in, first out. I shouldn't say never, there's a few people. Makes any sense. If the Yankees did this last in, first out, the season they had last year would have been even worse, if you can imagine that, much less the Cubs. So this is, but why do we do it? We do it because the power forces, and it's not simply unions, it's unions and school boards and superintendents are locked in a game about the status quo, because that's the political life. And when Chris says how many legislators would do the right thing rather than a reelectable thing, and Nelson Brom says 5%, he says he's an optimist, well, look, that ain't a whole lot different for superintendents and a whole lot of other people. That's the nature of the political infrastructure we face. So to me, the question really is, and why I want to go off script a little bit, is I do think teaching matters. And I do think looking at those schools that are knocking the leather off the ball, that give us hope, I think that matters. But the question we need to face as a nation is how we're going to get from here to there. And my own view is the fuel for this fire, the political fight worth having, is school choice. Now, I didn't always hold that view, but the reason I hold that view is it has two dimensions to it. One is a sort of negative and the other is a positive. But I want to start with an equity point. This mother, who I'd never met before, said her kids go to private school because I assume she wants what's best for her children. And I bet you there's not a single person in this entire room that would allow me to randomly assign your kid to a public school in New York City. You're nodding your head, yes. Not a single person would allow that. You insist on school choice. Now, if the school in your neighborhood's great and you're happy with it, if you want to go to PS6 and you think that's great, sure, you're going to go to your neighborhood school. But if you think PS6 is no good, you're not going to just say, well, I'll put my kid there and hope that Joel Klein makes PS6 better in the next 3, 4, 5, 7, or 9 years, and we'll see what shakes out. It doesn't work that way. Who has no choice? It's the people who can't move, people who, to another neighborhood, people who can't go to private schools. Those people, it's one and done. So the kids with the greatest needs have no choice, whereas all of us insist on choice. But there's a second reason to me, and that is all these questions we're trying to decide. We're trying to decide as if they're an obvious answer and one Wizard of Oz should impose them on the system, even if you had the political power. There are no perfect eval systems, and it's unfortunate that in any city or state you're going to have only one, that we don't have the kind of differentiation that you would see anyplace else. When I was in the private sector, we evaluated people differently in my company from another company, as we do now. We set up important evaluations. It says, one of the reporters asked before, should it all be based, or how much should be based on value add? There's no obvious answer to that. But I guess what I would love to see is many different evaluation systems and see which ones work more effectively, which ones teachers think are fairer. You know, when you say, Evan, teacher voice, the trouble is there's no homogeneity of teacher voice. It's not like if you ask all teachers what's the right eval system, they're going to say. And so we've got a fundamental, in my view, misguided model, which is a model called what I call the Wizard of Oz model. And somebody in central headquarters is going to decide all of these issues for an entire city. Now, I think we're at a point in history where the challenges are such that if we don't get smart about choice and real choice, and it ain't going to happen overnight, but I don't think there are any overnight solutions, I think we're going to miss our bet. If we continue to think that a series of high-level driven policies are going to somehow fix it, look at America, right? Right now, the saving grace in our economy is the dynamism of our entrepreneurs and the differentiation. Things we don't imagine are growing up in garages. Yet if you try things, and I tried a lot of things, and some of the things we tried flat out didn't work, I'm here to tell you. But if you try something, you're criticized because you say you're experimenting. But if Google didn't try search, or if Facebook didn't try the social network, or if this one, or things we don't know, that kind of dynamism and differentiation that competition will bring, I think, is the greatest hope. Because right now, there's such a lack of dynamism. People ask me what I liked least about being school chancellor, and I loved the job, best job I ever had. The two things I liked least were to be in a system in which merit didn't matter, seniority did, and an absolute lack of dynamism, where people didn't come to you and say, let's try something different. This really could have huge impact. Let's open up a school like the Equity Project, pay people twice as much. And all the critics get all wound up. Oh, this can't work, et cetera. You're going to have larger class. Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. The New American Academy, 4 teachers, they get paid from $120,000 down to $45,000. They get ranked by peer review and eval. They may like that. And they get kids from kindergarten through to 5th grade, 60 kids, 4 teachers, and they're responsible. Is that going to be the winning formula? I don't know. But why should we continue to have one person from Central, like cookie cutters? Like if you go to Dale City, whatever you call it, on the way from the San Francisco airport, and that great song, all in boxes, little boxes, ticky-tacky. That's the model. And I think the model is broken. And if we don't fix the model, I think we're going to continue to have these great debates in which people are going to say, candid, like Chris said, we don't have a perfect system. And then somebody else can say, well, before you impose your imperfect system on my 100,000 employees, make it better. And instead, if you move toward a system where dynamism is brought into it, we will learn from each other. Great industry understands the worst three letters are NIH, not invented here. And we need to change that discussion. We have a natural experiment, still a work in progress in New Orleans because of the tragedy of Katrina, where we do have a choice system, and they're getting real results and learning from each other. And I think one of the great things we did in New York is what happened with the charter movement in Harlem in particular. If you go up to Harlem, you want to talk about parental engagement, parents are much more engaged because they have real choice up there. Parents know a whole lot about Seth's program and Chip and about Eva Moskowitz's program. And you know, all of those folks, they compete with each other too, and I think it's good. Each year when I was chancellor, I said, well, you did pretty good. Take a look at this one did, right? And I think that's good for our kids to get a little juice flowing into the system, let them differentiate, let them try to figure out how to get better. But it's a pretty powerful statistic today in this city. Last year, there were 64,000 families, virtually all families of color, applied for 13,000 charter seats. That meant that there were 51,000 families who wanted a choice they couldn't get, and yet we still have people, literally as we speak, blocking the opening of new charter schools because of what parents, which demonstrably what parents want. And they claim to be doing that in the name of protecting the interests of parents and families. So let me end on this core point, because I think it's really critical. For all the years K-12 has been knocked, and that's been true for the last 25 or so years, at least since a nation at risk. During that same time, America was always seen to have the best post-secondary system in the world. Still is today for all of its problems. That system was built on choice and competition, not on a model of a monopoly provider. And remember, folks, not a person in this room would allow me to simply say, your kid goes to the neighborhood school. If I did that and it was no good, you would move. What's good enough for our children should be good enough for all the kids in this city and in this nation. And if we don't get on that pathway, I continue to think we're going to end up, in most respects, trying to do things that the system will not allow to be done. Marcus, again, thank you for this terrific contribution.
We have time for a few questions for the Chancellor. Again, if you could just identify yourself and make sure it ends in a question mark. Sir, right up here on the center aisle. One moment for the microphone.
Thank you. John Schmidt. I'm with the Common Sense Institute in New Jersey. This was kind of touched on in a couple of the comments, the role of the schools of pedagogy. I've read, and I don't know how true this is, but the United States is the only country that has schools of pedagogy at the university level. Can you comment on the role that they play? Do you believe they're part of the problem or part of the solution?
I believe they're part of the problem, and I think Seth Andrews said it right. I think if you, David Steiner's here, former commissioner in New York, who was the dean of the ed school at Hunter, doing some of the most interesting things there, and I'd urge you to talk to him about the challenges he faced. Yesterday I was with Arthur Levine, who was the president of Teachers College at Columbia. And the same kinds of practical problems. You need that certificate, and this is why I'm so sympathetic with Seth's point. You need that certificate. Now we've got a few alternative certificate programs like Teach for America, et cetera. But you always needed that. That was the way to punch your ticket, and then you could move into the field. But those schools almost always, not always, don't focus remotely enough on content, which is critical to the educational exercise. As a result, we have too much what I call self-referential learning. My favorite example, a major textbook, gives you the Gettysburg Address to read and asks you a question. The question is, Lincoln refers to a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Have you or anyone you know had an experience lately with the government of the people, by the people, for the people? By definition, it means you don't have to read the Gettysburg Address to answer this question. The Gettysburg Address is a pretty complicated text that, in my experience, most of the kids who studied it didn't truly understand it. And if the teacher doesn't understand why Lincoln starts with the Declaration of Independence rather than the Constitution, the kids aren't going to learn that. And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand the power of what happened between the Declaration and the Constitution and why Lincoln had to start with the Declaration, which wasn't the document that brought forth a new nation on this continent. So this whole thing to me, that pedagogy matters, of course, but content and knowledge matter, and we have got to drive that, and we have got to make sure that the ed schools run for the benefit of the kids they're teaching. I used to say when deans came to me, what can I do to help you? I used to say to them all the time, I have a great idea. Take one of my schools, any one of them, and you run it. Make all the hiring decision, firing decision, however you want to do it, you run it. And when you show me you can really do a great job teaching my kids, I'm going to be so happy to see you teach my teachers. I didn't get many takers, I got to tell you.
Next question. We'll go up here and then back to that corner. I think we have time for about 3.
All right.
Joel, thanks very much. My name's Peter Denton. I'm the chairman and founder of Excellent Education for Everyone in New Jersey, a school reform and in particular a school choice organization, as many of you know. There's been a divide, in my view, of the education reform world, and it was recently laid out, I think, specifically in one of Whitney Tilson's emails, perhaps his last one. Would it be fair, Joel, in your mind, to say that there's 2 types of folks in the education reform world? Those that think you can fix this monopoly and those that think you can only fix it by breaking it up?
Again, to quote Chris Cerf, who taught me everything I know on this, so I'm happy to quote him. I think it's a false dichotomy. We can't do all of these things at once, so I think there are things that need to be done to fix the existing system. Change LIFO, for example, right now, because that's going to impact people in tight economies. But my own view is the lever for change long-term that matters most is choice. And I think that is a place where a lot of reformers really do disagree, and I think you're right to call out the disagreement. I don't think it's a perfect disagreement. People like myself who supported lots of internal changes nevertheless realize that some choice can actually facilitate change. And I have no doubt personally that one of the reasons Michelle Rhee was able to get the contract she got in D.C. was because about 40% of the kids had left the D.C. public school systems for charters, and that gave you leverage. But I think this basic dichotomy, while not a perfect dichotomy, is nevertheless a flavor in each direction is right.
The gentleman back here with the blue shirt. Yep.
Hi. My name is Dave Weinreb, and I'm the business manager for the Equity Project Charter School. My question is essentially, Joel, what are some of the great models of thoughtful teacher evaluation that you've seen done efficiently that would get schools psyched to sort of sign up?
So you know, again, great models are hard to find, but I've seen them at different charter schools in particular, which are not based entirely on sort of 1 for 80,000, which is a hard game to play. Mostly what I think the way you evaluate people is you have to exercise discretion. And that's why I think we're caught in this conundrum in K-12. Because if you use discretion, then people say, well, the principal is going to, play his favorites or her favorites or all the other things like that. That's only because the school must not be held to account. Because if you're held to account, you can't get rid of the people who are good and not be good. And if you're a good principal, you should be able to tell who are the good teachers, who those you think you can improve, and so forth. But there's also a dimension of performance that I would look at. It's called Billy Ball. And I would look at the numbers. And I'd be the first to tell you there's no perfect tests out there. But nevertheless, there was nobody in New York City ever in the time I was there who said a kid who was a 3 or who went from a 2 to a 3 wasn't making some progress, whereas a kid who went from a 3 to a 2 wasn't losing progress. So I would try to use those factors. I wouldn't use them in a formulaic way. It's not the way I evaluated lawyers when I ran a law firm. It's not the way I evaluate my team at News Corp, and it's not the way I would evaluate teachers. But the trouble is you got to bargain this whole thing in a one-and-done contract, and that leads to limitations of flexibility in order to try to handcuff people, and I don't think that model is going to work.
All right. Jerry? Right. She's coming around the other side.
Jerry Cantrell, Common Sense Institute of New Jersey. You know, we've been talking about this issue for 30, 40 years, from the 70s, I guess, and I'm not sure we've made much progress. In fact, we may be going the opposite way. So it seems like to me that, you know, we continue to focus on the symptoms rather than the problem. And it would occur to me that there needs to be, you know, almost a Manhattan project type of program put together nationally to come up with some concrete solutions that people can agree to. You're fighting a losing war. You're not going to be able to combat the political opposition here in many cases, et cetera, so you're always going to look for some tiny little wins. This is a situation that confronts this country, and we've got a generation that's following us on multiple levels that they don't even understand because they've never seen anything any different. So it seems to me that folks like yourself with name power out there need to lead this on a national basis. So I challenge, you know, my question is really, is there the political will, the commitment to, and the courage to be able to do that?
I think more and more there is, but there's also going to be the political realities to push back and so forth. And I think Chris diagnosed it quite well. But it goes to what I said in my remarks, which I think is a fundamental question. At what point in this country are we going to be able to figure out that the special interests are now dictating the outcomes in core policy areas time and again, and where we need the kind of leadership to say, I mean, we have some of the most irrational gun control policies I've ever seen. We've got irrational immigration policies. We've got irrational healthcare policies. And we've got irrational education policies. Now, of them all, I care the most about the education policies because I think the future of the country depends on something that was part of my own existence, a thing called the American dream, based on getting an education that wasn't based on where you grew up or your family's income. So to me, that's the biggest driver. But the answer to your question is, when are people in this room, when a politician comes to see them for a contribution, when are they going to say, the thing I want to see you prioritize is education reform, not some tax break or some issue in energy policy? And to me, what I've been trying to think a lot about is how do we create something that right now doesn't seem front and center in America, which is the things that unite us have got to be larger and more important than the things that divide us. And until we figure out how to generate that so that instead of saying the pie is fixed and if my slice is smaller, your slice will be bigger, so take a smaller slice for me and a bigger slice for you, how do we figure out a shared sense? You know, I always think about Tom Brokaw's book. It had a big, big impact on me. There was a day in this world, in my father's world, where people put their life on the line for a country they desperately believed in. And now all we're trying to argue about is mine bigger or yours smaller? And that's, to me, the fundamental issue you raise. But in the meantime, before we have a Manhattan Project, we have a Manhattan Institute book that I really want all of you to read. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Chancellor.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.